mission now. I'm on a mission now. I'm on a mission now. I'm on a mission now.
Welcome back to the mission. Yaqoob here, AKA JoziFly, and today we are bringing you two awesome nymph patterns for the Vaal. These patterns I typically fish in tandem. They can be fished with other patterns, but we're bringing you 2 for 1 today. So while we do have 2 patterns that are quite similar, simple, easy to tie patterns, it does give us a bit of option. On the Spinky, we have this loud attractor pattern. With the Purple Crush PTN, we've got a fly that's a bit more subtle in the way of hot spots. I mean, we've got a bit of orange in there with a lot of natural colors throughout the fly. So there's a bit of option there. If the fish are not too keyed in on something as bright and as loud as the Spinky. So typically my rig would consist of a point fly and a dropper fly, and those would be about 30 centimeters apart. All depends on the scenario at the time, but I'd fish this definitely in tandem with the Spinky or a caddis pupa of sorts. Very effective pattern for smallmouth yellowfish on the Vaal. So this pattern is called the Spinky, and it is a pattern that was tied or developed by my friend Etienne Beekes, and the pattern was born on the streams in the Muldersdrift Koppies, where we fished for large scale and small scale yellowfish. The original had a silver bead and the rest was the same as this one. I then decided to go with a pink bead, and this has been an exceptionally awesome pattern for the Vaal River. It works tremendously well for small and large scale yellowfish as well, and I'm sure it will fool plenty trout too. Cool, so this pattern is a attractor pattern. Like most blowtorch patterns are, or patterns with a lot of hotspots or triggers in them. It's basically a variation of a blowtorch attractor pattern. Typically I'd fish this fly on my dropper, and it will all depend on the scenario and situation, but fished in tandem with probably a PTN of sorts with a caddis pupa imitation. The fly is quite effective in that sense. I would typically fish this in a head or a tail of a pool. It barely hits the water surface and it gets hit really hard. It's one of those light switch patterns. Once you tie it on, you're into fish. We've got a Mouche 6438 in size 16. It's an awesome heavy wire, thick gauge hook, which is perfect for our yellowfish. Nice strong hook in a size 60, and it's got a nice wide gape. And I pair that with a 3.5 millimeter dark pink tungsten bead. You can go with light pink or silver as the original. The next material is pink floss. This is quite a dark pink. I'm not 100% certain what the color or name of the color is, but pink should do the trick. For the rest of the fly, basically the body and thorax, Hairline Ice Dub in UV black. Black CDC for the collar. The CDC is in there for some movement, as well as depending on how much CDC you get onto the fly to maybe slow the fly down in the drift. Typically with this pattern, that's why I'd oversize it with a larger bead on the size 16, and the CDC just adds life to the fly and can slow it down in a drift. And yeah, that's basically it. I've got a size 16 Mouche 6438 in the vise. I'll generally tie this pattern in a size 16 and pair that with a 3.5mm bead or a 3mm bead depending on the scenario. And we'll get started with my thread, which in this case is just some black power thread or GSP. And once we get the thread started there, we are going to tie in our tail, which is pink floss. So just grab a bit of pink floss and I'm going to fold that over 4 times to give me the desired thickness that I will be using. And once I have that folded over, I'm going to tie that in right behind the bead. And secure that all the way back to the bend of the hook. And with these blowtorch type flies, don't be shy to go slightly beyond the bend of the hook, and I'll come in there and snip that clean. Generally, good rule of thumb is to place the scissor against the bend of the hook, and that will always give you a perfect tail. And then we're going to remove the waist. And when it comes to the body of the material, it is just built off of black UV ice dub. In this specific pattern, we won't be using any ribbing materials, and I'll show you why in a bit. So I'm going to dub a fairly thin noodle of the dubbing onto the thread. And before I start dubbing that on, so I'm just going to grab a bit of super glue and just a little dab super glue onto our thread before we start dubbing the body. And that's just going to help us add a bit more durability to the fly. And as I dub on, I'll create that taper going forward all the way to behind the bead. And if you do run out of dubbing, just add a little more. Always remember, less is more. So I'll get that all the way to behind the bead. At this point, we are going to come in with some black CDC. And when selecting CDC feathers for your nymphs, and it could be for any other fly, I typically like to go for the stuff with the thinner barbs. It just works nicely on nymphs. And what I'll do is, if there is any fluff in the bottom, I'll get rid of that by just pulling that off. And I will then select the amount of CDC I will be using in this pattern. If you do have one of those fancy patagine tools, you can use one of those. I'm just going to snip this off there, and basically use that CDC on this pattern, and you've got another clump there for another fly if you are tying multiple back to back. So I'm just going to grab my bodkin and flatten my thread and split that thread in half, and then I'll just slide the CDC between the thread there, our split thread, and put a bit of tension on your thread so that the CDC does not fall out. And what I'll do is I'll come in and just snip that clean, and whoop. And once I've got that in, I'll give my bobbin holder a spin, just to give us sort of a little CDC brush. If you do have fibers that get stuck into the thread or other materials, you can just pick that out with your bodkin, and we are left with a little CDC brush, if you will. And before we start wrapping that on, what I like to do is just comb all the fibers into one direction, keeping tension on your bodkin. And once I've got that in place, I will then wrap the CDC on, and as I wrap, I will coax the fibers rearward. And once we've got that secured, we can then come in with our black ice dub again. And basically this is just going to fill in the collar, not really the thorax of our pattern. And this is just to give the CDC something to push up against, so that it creates this kind of flow rearward. So what I'll do is stroke those fibers back and then just dub in that little collar, and then come in with our whip finish tool. And at this point you can add some super glue, a 3-turn whip finish, and if you want to just add another 3 turns there for added durability, and snip away your thread, and that is your finished fly. Cool, so let's get started on the Purple Crush PTN. It is basically a PTN with a hot spot and some CDC with a bit of ice dub worked into the collar. The hook is basically a Mouche 6438. It's an awesome thick or heavy wire gauge hook. It's perfect for our yellowfish, perfect for the Vaal, in a size 16. Beads are gold slotted tungsten beads in size 3.5 millimeter, and you could swap these out for 3, 2.5, 2 millimeter, depending on the scenario and what weight you are looking for. The tail is made up of cocktailion. 3 fibers is more than enough for the tail. We then go in with a bit of orange thread, and this is not a fluorescent orange, but just an orange thread, and that does make a difference sometimes. Basically something I've learned on the small streams fishing for small and large scale yellowfish. And that orange thread will basically be our tag, our hotspot, as well as our ribbing. Some olive pheasant tail, and you could use dark olive, light olive, or golden olive, doesn't really matter. I typically use olive because you'll always find it in stock. Everyone's buying natural, so use olive. And for basically our thorax and collar, it's just a bit of natural CDC and a purple ice dub. This is a real fly fishing ice dub. It's called Purple Crush. Awesome color dubbing. So in the vise, I've got a size 16 hook paired with a 3.5 millimeter bead. To get started, we are going to grab our orange thread. This is just to work in a orange tag on our pattern, but at the same time we are going to use it for the ribbing on this pattern. So I'll get that started and trim away the waste. Come in with some cocktailion. For a nymph, I would go with 3 fibers, and that should be sufficient, more than enough. I haven't seen a nymph on the Vaal yet with more than 3 barbs for a tail, so 3 should suffice. So Normally when I work with my CDL feathers, I'd strip away the fluff. So let's just get in here with the scissor. Generally a hook shank length, and we'll tie that in on the top of the shank. And every so often I will flatten my thread, and that's just to give me a nice flat even base to work with. And if I do need to adjust the tail, just tug slightly on it, and I'm happy with that length. And we'll come in and secure that CDL, just making sure it stays on the top of the hook. And one little thing I forgot to mention is, as you can see, I'm using a orange thread, but it is not a fluorescent orange thread. And I have found that that does make a difference sometimes. So once we've secured the tail, I'm gonna then work my orange thread forward to behind the bead, but I'm not gonna cut that away. I'm gonna come in with my black GSP thread and attach that to the hook at the waist, and I'm going to wrap rearward while I hold the orange thread bobbin in my left hand, and we're just going to go all the way back to about that point, so we leave a bit of a hot tag, if you will. And I'll just set that bobbin off to the side, or if you want to, you can basically just snip that off at this point, but just to keep things out the way. And then I'm going to come in with my pheasant tail. I prefer using olive or golden olive pheasant tail. That way you'll always find pheasant tail at a store, because generally it's always the natural color stuff that gets sold out. For the abdomen of the fly, 3 pheasant tail fibers is more than enough, and we'll just make sure that those tips are aligned. And I'm going to offer that to the side of the fly facing myself, and just secure that all the way forward to behind the bead. If your vise does have a bobbin rest, you can set your bobbin on the bobbin rest and start to wrap your pheasant tail forward with close touching turns. And I'll normally switch the pheasant tail from hand to hand, or have my left hand assisting me, just so that I keep the pheasant tail flat when I'm wrapping it onto the shank. That does give you a nice, neater finish. And once we get to this point, I will then snip away my extra bobbin here. So we are going to use that bit of orange thread as our rib, and we'll just rib that forward. Three turns, 4 turns should be enough. Secure that. Come in and snip away the waist, as well as the pheasant tail waist up there. Generally, I would use a extra small gold wire as ribbing, but in this case we will use some orange thread, just to give it a bit more of an attraction or attractor for the fish to key in on. So the thorax is basically just made up of a CDC and dubbing collar. It's extremely simple. So I'm going to be using some Purple Crush Ice Dub. This is by Real Fly Fishing. It's a really awesome color ice dub, and we don't need much for this. Just a couple of strands should be enough. And what we are going to do is just set that aside for now and prep our CDC feather. For your CDC, natural CDC should be fine. Brown, olive will work as well. And when I do prep my CDC feathers, any of the fluff down the bottom that I don't need, I will strip away, but that stuff looks good, so I'll work with that. And what I will do is I will take a bit more CDC out here because I am not going to be putting a thorax on this fly. And I'll snip that away, and that little bit can give you 2 more flies. This section should give us 2 flies as well. So cool thing here is what I typically do with this pattern is, again, if you've got this cool Patagon magic tools, you can use that. But what I do is I just grab the dubbing that we removed out the bag and I just stack that on top of the CDC. I mean, as wild and untidy as possible. And if it's not enough, I will grab another small clump. Again, just stack that on as untidy as possible, doesn't matter. And I'll just hold that in my left hand, grab my bodkin, and we are going to split the thread. And once we've got our thread split, we are going to offer that CDC and purple crush ice dub to our thread, just like that. And I will come in with a good long sharp pair of scissors and trim that away. Give your bobbin a clockwise spin, and what we are left with is a CDC and ice dub brush. I will come in with a bodkin and just pick at that a bit just to get some of those fibers from the ice dub to stick out a bit. And once I'm happy with that, I'll put some tension on my bobbin holder and stroke all those fibers in one direction and start to palmer or wrap that onto the fly. With each wrap, I will stroke the fibers rearward. Just keep things nice and tidy without getting any of the CDC trapped under the previous wrap. And once we've got that wrapped on, just a couple of securing wraps behind the bead. And as mentioned, this pattern does not have a thorax. I'll then come in with my whip finish tool, 3-turn whip finish, snip away your thread. If the CDC is quite long, or a bit long, you can always come in there and trim it. So what I'll do is basically grab the fly with the tips of my fingers ending at the bend of the hook and just come in with your left hand and break that away, and that will give you shorter fibers and a better finish. Doesn't matter though, you can keep them as long as you want. And that is the finished product. Awesome little fly for the bowl.